Trench warfare is one of the most brutal forms of combat. With each side dug into defensive positions, brutal stalemates occur and casualties soar. In this video, I'm continuing my project to build a realistic trench warfare table for miniature wargames, split into 3 sections. In the first episode, I built a network of trenches, cladding the edges with revetments and lining the floors with duckboards. We built firing bays and bridges over the trenches, and reinforced the edges with sandbags. In this episode, we're picking up where we left off, building a scarred and brutal no man's land to complete the middle section of the table. You're watching Eric's Hobby Workshop, and this is Trench Warfare. No man's land refers to the area between 2 opposing defensive lines, an area without shelter that both sides can fire into that is so dangerous and hotly contested, neither side can claim to hold it, hence no man's land. This area is often a hellish killing ground, scarred by craters, debris, ruined vehicles, and scattered with casualties that neither side could risk recovering. Planning my board, there were many features that I knew I wanted to include, to capture the essence of this hellish zone on my table. Before I could start construction, there were some key challenges and constraints that I needed to consider for this project. First of all, I needed to consider the practicality of this project as a wargaming table. In many battlefields throughout history, no man's land is a flat and barren place, made all the more dangerous for the fact that it lacks any features to hide behind as troops advance. While realism is important to me, I do intend to use this table for wargames, specifically Warhammer 40k and the Horus Heresy. In those games, if the game has no cover features to disrupt line of sight, the game is negatively impacted. I also thought that it would be more interesting to look at if I could provide some cover features as well. In the first section of this build, I laid down some 2-inch insulation foam to form the ground, which would allow me to cut below grade to make the dugout trenches that I needed. I did the same on this section to keep the ground level the same. Now I knew to begin with that I could add some interest and cover to no man's land with craters. These would at least provide some variation in the terrain, as well as giving the impression that huge explosions had scarred the battlefield. Using a sharp craft knife, I cut these into the foam. It's easier to break the foam into pieces to do this, so that's what I did. I glued the foam down with some Gorilla Glue construction adhesive and used my whole body to weight it down while it dried, because sometimes these foam sheets have a slight warp to them straight from Home Depot. In the reference photos that I looked at to prepare for this project, there was a fairly common sight that I wanted to include. A tank, disabled by the fighting or stuck in the mud, pitched upwards out of a crater or trench. I decided this would be a perfect piece of cover. It has a logical reason for being there, and narratively it communicates that some intense fighting has already occurred in this spot. Now logically, of course, the bigger the tank, the more cover it would provide, so I chose the biggest tank that I could. Enter the Shadow Sword, the largest tank that you can get in a plastic kit for Warhammer. This class of tanks existed in both Warhammer 40k and the Horus Heresy, and it has enough size to fit the role nicely. Now the kit is fairly expensive, but luckily I found an incomplete version in a local shop for a fraction of the price. It's in bad shape, and it's missing treads and a barrel, but because it'll be ruined, I knew I could make it work. I began preparing the tank for the table, starting with the barrel, which I constructed from some toy pipe and a bit of PVC conduit. Since this tank was going to be ruined, I had the idea to feature the barrel splayed out from an internal explosion, as if a mine had been planted into the barrel or some obstruction had caused the fired shell to detonate within the muzzle. As a kid, I never knew if this was a real thing that happened to guns or not, but I have vivid memories of this happening to Elmer Fudd in Looney Tunes cartoons after Bugs Bunny plugs Elmer's gun with a carrot or something. Now I found tons of reference pictures of this happening to real tanks, with the barrel splayed out in all directions and blackened. But this is where something strange happened. I couldn't find a single clip of this happening to Elmer Fudd. I began to think this might be an instance of the Mandela effect. In any event, I used some PVC pipe cutters to snip the barrel, then bend it into the correct shape. Now, I considered carefully if using this tank as a feature on the battlefield would ruin the ability to use this table for historical wargames, and it was something that nagged at me for several reasons. First of all, the tank is very large, but after doing a bit of research, there were other tanks that were extremely large throughout history as well, such as the French Char 2C. But I also began thinking about the possibility of top-secret experimental tank prototypes, many of which may have performed poorly and ended up stuck or destroyed on the first battlefield they deployed on. Now, since I'm not primarily a historical wargamer, I figured I could suspend my disbelief to consider this Shadow Sword a secret prototype tank on a historical battlefield. The aesthetics aren't so far removed that this would be impossible. If If you guys enjoy historical warfare and vehicles like this, you might enjoy the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat ever made, and is available now for free on PC and consoles. Take command of over 2,500 military vehicles ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. With detailed vehicles and realistic sound and graphics, it's an immersive experience. With a worldwide community of over 70 million players playing PvP battles, it's a game well suited to fans of military history. In War Thunder, the vehicles aren't just boxes with hit points, and the damage your vehicle takes depends on where it's hit, with an X-ray view even showing the specific damage taken. There are tons of options for customization as well, so you can make your vehicles your own. Download War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using the link in the pinned comment or video description. New players will get a massive bonus pack with the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account. You can also get some festive decals like these snails shown here, so check it out. Now let's get back to the project. Because this table is planned for 3 sections, and I want the third section of this table to be a raised hill with an embedded fortification, I had to start planning that at this stage. I began blocking in the rough shape of the hill with layers of foam as well. At this point, I had the idea to add another cool feature to this end of the table. Something else that I'd seen in a lot of reference photos over No Man's Land were crashed planes, no doubt shot down by the massive gun lines that the trenches house and protect. This time, an old Valkyrie flyer that I picked up used at the same local shop. I wanted to add a cool skidding impact crater and have it sticking up above the ground on a crazy angle. This piece will be removable as well, in case I don't want it in the way or decide it isn't right for the battle I'm playing in terms of historical accuracy. I dug a little furrow for it, and after some testing and guesswork, I started building up the shape of the displaced earth with tinfoil and hot glue. I was able to make a fairly stable little spot for the ship where it can stand up on its own and be removable easily as well. Using the same method of hot glue and tinfoil, I created some piles of displaced earth around the craters, and I also used the tinfoil and hot glue to smooth out some of the rougher transitions in the hill and fill some small gaps as well. Now at this point, I decided it was time to cover the whole piece in a mixture that looked like churned up earth. I mix up a blend of caulking, sand, grout, house paint, and a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to thin it down. Now I know from experience from the first part of this build that one coat won't be enough, so I was happy to get the initial layer down. I apply it generously with a large paintbrush, trying to push it into all the cracks and crevices. As I mentioned, this is just the first layer, so it's not going to be perfect at this stage. But the more gaps I fill now, the less I'll have to fill later. As the first layer dried, I painted the tank using an airbrush, and I initially painted the tank a camo green color, but I later changed my mind and decided to repaint it a pale gray. My reasoning for this was that I wanted the color to show dirt and grime better, and I also didn't want to add any new colors to the bleakness of the battlefield. I won't go too in-depth into the painting process. I do have a whole video about painting tanks that I'll link here if you're interested. I did, however, add some red and white markings near the front of the tank, inspired by British M4 tanks. This gives it a bit of historical grounding and adds an interesting visual element as well. With a sponge, I added some chipping marks with dark grey to the edges, making the whole thing seem a bit more beat up and damaged. I added some streaks and scratches to the bottom and sides as well, and I sealed the whole model with gloss varnish. Here comes the fun part, dirtying this thing up. I mixed up a mix of brown oil paint and mineral spirits to make a thin, grimy wash, and I applied it generously to the tanks. This seeps into the recesses around the rivets and creates some interesting staining, discoloring patterns, but unlike an acrylic wash, it has a very different surface tension than regular water, so the drips don't appear to be out of scale. Now this tank will be at an angle on the table, so I added some filthy streaking marks on that same angle, making it look like the cast up mud from explosions has been trickling down the sides of this wreck as it sits here in the rain. Hell yeah. Now I decided I wanted to enhance the illusion of how sunk this tank is into the crater, so using a Dremel tool, I cut off the front part on an angle. Since the treads were missing from this destroyed model, I 3D printed some alternate treads with a bit more detail, and I made them into loose sections with some card, making it look like the tracks had derailed and loosened from the tank as it endured the damage that immobilized it. I attached these with glue and painted them as well. Another key feature that I wanted to include on my table are some dead trees. blasted into wretched husks by bombs, shrapnel, and bullets. These trees are a stark reminder that this area might have once been lush and full of life and is now a bleak wasteland degraded by war. I used some natural twigs for these and was happy to be able to give my newest and possibly most dangerous gadget a spin, this miniature table saw. This saw allowed me to make short work of these sticks, getting a nice flat edge to stand these trees up. I debated sticking these right into the table, but I ultimately made another practical choice here to make the table easier to store and to play on. I decided to mount the trees on small bases of PVC board, leaving me the freedom to move them around later. I glued them upright, then using tinfoil I embedded them in some embankments of earth and mud. This will reinforce their stability, but also make for some interesting shapes to use as low cover. I painted the bases black, then painted the trees a drab dark grey with bursts of paint from the airbrush, leaving them scorched and dead looking. Once dry, I applied more mud mixture to the bases so they blend in nicely with the table. With the table dry, I decided to add a few more craters, so with my craft knife I cut into the muddy surface, revealing the pink foam below. I tried not to think about Neapolitan ice cream while doing this. I added some more tinfoil with hot glue to get the shapes that I wanted, and then added another layer of mud mixture to cover and blend these additions. I also added some more displaced mud and earth to make the tank fit nicely into the crater where I wanted it, building up a muddy furrow. I came up with a way to attach these sections of table together using some latches that I purchased from Home Depot, and I'm pretty proud of this solution. I simply drilled some pilot holes, then screwed them on. These latches, when engaged, will allow the table to clip together in a rock-solid way, so you don't have to worry about the table sections separating during gameplay. One of the reasons it took me so long to make this video since the last installment was the fact that I had to make some tough creative decisions about how graphic and brutal I wanted this table to be. As I described before, No Man's Land is a killing ground, where countless soldiers would be cut down and lose their lives, their bodies often lying there, unrecoverable without great risk. Now, while I'll be playing some fantasy games on this table, I did want it to have the grounding in real war, and it's important to remember that everyone who dies in war is a real person, someone's child who had dreams and aspirations of their own, someone's brother, someone's father maybe, whose life was cut short by violence. The idea of making a gruesome charnel pit of the bodies in the center felt like a tricky subject to handle. I certainly don't want to glorify the horror of war, or trivialize the fallen soldiers who lost their lives. But the more I thought about it, making a No Man's Land without any casualties would reflect a sanitized version of war that would allow us to ignore the horror rather than confronting and accepting it. So after some careful consideration and searching the internet, I found some files that I think will be appropriate for casualties for this table. I've been painting up an army of Imperial Guard, which is a faction for Warhammer 40k, and I've given them custom painted heads sculpted by Saint Decent, which feature helmets reminiscent of Brody helms from the First World War. I called these troops the Chundorian 12th, and I painted them in drab military browns and greys so that these soldiers would look right at home on my trench table. Even though they're armed with futuristic las rifles, there's something very grounded about their appearance that I really like. I decided to tie in the casualties with my force, giving them the same palette and color scheme. This way, the bodies on the table will look like the previous wave of troops from the same Grand Army who have been reinforced by my soldiers. I painstakingly painted over 24 casualties, and even converted some to match the helmets of the Chundorian 12th. With my casualties painted, I added another layer of mud. In part 1 of this video, I'd made some Frisian horses holding coils of barbed wire, and I now broke and mangled these, embedding them partially into the mud and making them look like a tangled mess destroyed by bombardment. I added some loose twigs and debris as well, then carefully pressed my painted casualties into the mud. I took great care with the poses of the dead, trying to think about which direction they would have been moving when they fell, and trying to get their bodies into natural positions. I added casualties to some of the tree bases as well to tie them in with the rest of the scene. With everything in place, I gave the whole table a wash of thinned down black acrylic paint with a drop of dish soap, giving the flat-looking mud areas some depth and relief. Of course, I applied this wash to the tree bases as well so they'd match the table. When all 3 parts are done, I intend to add a muddy water effect to the bottom of the craters to make sure the color matches on all 3 parts. But for now, with these elements complete, I'm calling part 2 finished. I'm very happy with the results of this piece so far, and I'm really excited about the direction this project is going. One thing I need to fix when the whole table is finished is the size and obviousness of the gap between table sections. I've come up with a solution for that already that should make it nearly invisible, but that'll have to wait until the 3rd part is complete. Another aspect I need to add is blood, but since some of the bodies will be partially submerged in muddy water, blood effects also need to wait for the water pouring stage to look the way I want. I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. If you want to support me on Patreon, check the description box below. If you're enjoying this project, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss part 3. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember to download it for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using the link in the pinned comment or video description to collect your bonus pack with the exclusive Eagle of Valor Vehicle Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account with the exclusive Festive Decals.